Hey guys, welcome to Mr. H Makes. This week we're going to be doing an introduction into making movies in Unreal and covering the various techniques I use to make my animated shorts. This video is intended for people interested in using Unreal as a movie making tool, and it is for beginners, and this particular one is as an overview. I'll expand on various concepts in further tutorials in the future, but as it is, it's meant to give you a quick idea how you might be able to get up and running and animating in Unreal. We'll explore how to get characters into Unreal and how to animate them, as well as animating cameras. I'm using iClone as my program to animate my characters, but the same concepts will apply once you get your animations into Unreal. If you are using iClone to export your FBXs, I am assuming that you have watched this previous video. If you haven't, link on the right, that will give you detailed instructions on how to get your FBXs into Unreal. That's if you're using iClone. In later videos, we'll cover importing FBXs from CC3, which is required for animation retargeting. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to bring in the iClone FBX. So once you've got your FBX character imported, you can just drag him onto the viewport, and we can start the process of filming him. So you're going to need to use the take recorder. If you are unable to see the take recorder or sequencer tabs on your interface, you can access them by going to Windows, Cinematics, and clicking on the appropriate tab. So I tend to look at the maps or the levels that you design as being your locations, and your slates are your scenes, and the takes are how many versions you take of various scenes. So for each take, you need to add your cameras and your various characters, basically anything that's going to be moving around in the scene. There are various different ways to add cameras, and I'll be covering them later. So various Unreal tutorials recommend that you do add in your sources anything that you need to change in the sequencer. But you can also add these elements after once you've recorded the take, and sometimes there are pros and cons to this. When you do record, just let it run over a bit, so that will give you room to edit. Especially if you plan on having things like dissolve transitions. So once you're done, you can click on the actual take itself to access it in the sequencer. And it's in the sequencer where you can manipulate, clip, and keyframe them so you can animate them. If everything is grayed out or you can't click on stuff, it's quite likely you haven't unlocked the take or the scene. Now we can add animations. The ones you see on the list are the ones available for that particular character. And these animations can be the ones you've made in your own 3D program. They can be free ones from Mixamo. There's also a bunch of free animations you can get from the Unreal Marketplace as well. I'll be covering retargeting animations in probably the next video. You can increase the duration of an animation by dragging on the bar in the timeline. But depending on the sort of animations you have, they will loop or not loop correctly. In this case, this one does not loop correctly, but it's just to demonstrate the idea. One of the other core concepts is the weighting of animations. You can combine them and dictate by how heavy each weight is, which animation is to have a heavier influence over your character, which clip affects it more. Like in this case, I'm using just a static pose on the clip above, and by giving it more weight, it impacts how the character moves. If you're using iClone, that exports animations out at 60 frames per second. So you're going to want to alter that in the various scenes and sub-scenes. I'm not sure what other 3D programs export out, but you might need to experiment with that. So in the sequencer, we can use it to animate characters, but you would also use this same interface to animate cameras as well. And we added one of those at the beginning of the take as a source, and we can animate it by keyframing its various transforms. Now, you may have an issue with keying the transforms, the location of the camera, but there are a couple of easy ways to fix this. One of them is to move like one of the locations just to kind of kickstart the whole thing. So you just drag on that with your mouse. And the other method is that there is another transform below, and if you use this should work properly. The second one is probably what you should look at first. Now always make sure you've got auto key on. This will make sure that your moves will be recorded as keyframes automatically. The other way to add cameras to your sequence is to click on the camera icon, and that will add a camera in the position that your viewport is in. And you'll see it in the world outliner there. The other method is to add a camera via the plus track button. But this method requires that you move the camera around to the position that you want. It doesn't automatically put it in the place you want like the other method. So you can use this track method in Sequencer to add any elements that you need to manipulate in a scene. If it's a static element, you wouldn't need to add it in here, like backgrounds. If you want to view a particular camera, you would just click on the associated icon. And to add a character, you would just select it in the world outliner and add it via the track button, and it will add to the sequencer. So the difference between adding something through the tape recorder at the beginning of the process and adding it after as an additional track is that for the former, for those added by the tape recorder, they get put into their own little sub clips or subsections which you have to click into to access, which for me, I find that for characters I'm animating, I prefer them added via an additional track. But for things like cameras, I have no problem with that. But it also depends on how many actors you have in your scene and how you want to organize things. And I should stress at this stage that this way of doing things is my personal preference. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a proper way to do it, but this is the way I kind of got used to. You know, the way that Unreal works, there are different ways to do things, so it's up to you to find out which way works best for you. This is a methodology that I find works easiest for me. It is possible that Epic might change something further down the line, but if they do so, I will let you know. So back to animating cameras. I'm experimenting with this one, trying to animate it in a way to capture the motion of the creature jumping. So I want to keep him in frame. So usually I would keyframe the final position of the camera and then keyframe the starting position. In this case, I'm dragging on the X location to get things started. And from there, after I've figured out the start location of the camera, I will just mess around in between. Unreal also has a bunch of rigs that can emulate cranes and camera tracks and things like that. But I kind of like the freedom to move around in any way that you like with a camera. But I'll cover those in a future tutorial. Sometimes you'll find that you have a frame of an animation that you want to end on, in which case if you right click on a clip you can access the keep state property, and that will freeze the animation in place, which can be useful when you're animating. You can also affect other things like play rate and things like that from the same properties menu. Obviously you could just record the animation in its entirety in the animation program you're using, but I find that knowing and understanding the capabilities of Unreal is good background knowledge to have. Accessing an animation clip's properties also gives you the ability to edit it in various ways, but you can achieve the same thing by dragging the end of the clip to the location you want it. You can also access various editing choices. If I have a smallish scene where there's just one camera or maybe two and a couple of characters, I tend to just like using the tape recorder to record the background, the set, and then I slowly add in the other elements or actors as individual tracks, because that way you see them all in the single scene, and you won't get sub sequences or sub clips where your cameras and your characters are on separate timelines and you have to jump back and forth to access them, to change animations and things like that. But that's my personal preference. And obviously if you have a lot more elements in a scene that require activation or animation, then you're going to want to organize them a bit better. But you can also organize things in their own folders within the sequencer. So there's that option too. Now, when I'm happy and done with what I have in a scene, I usually check it by using the legacy movie scene capture, which you can access by that little drop down arrow. I just use this to get a quick idea of whether everything is rendering properly. I just usually use a small resolution AVI file as an output, and I capture the movie just to double check whether everything is working. Like, for example, you got particle effects happening, or you don't want unnecessary characters popping up where they shouldn't be. I find it's quite a quick and easy way to preview. And you can stop at any stage as well, which is quite handy, because as soon as you see something wrong, usually it's going to happen in the beginning. Like, for example, this extra guy popping up, which I forgot to turn off. So I'll have to fix him. And to fix duplicate characters, you just basically got to hide the original version, the one without the lightning strike. Clicking on the icon isn't enough. You have to go into the details and switch off the visibility in the rendering section. And that should do the trick. Sometimes I also disable rendering in-game option, but that's probably a bit overkill. So here I'm just fiddling around a bit more with the camera, just tweaking. I find this ability to do a lot of stuff on the fly in Unreal lends itself to experimentation. So basically my workflow would be to create the level, the set design, and then light it, then bring in some characters and make sure they're lit okay, bring in a camera or two or more, and then apply the animations and tweak the cameras where necessary. And once I'm happy with what I have, I can then add facial animation to the character and just update the animation in Unreal after I've done it in iClone. In iClone, in this particular instance, I'm using the face key, which is like a really simple way to animate in between states, and is pretty good for an animation that you're not really going to see up close. So in this case, I just want him to have a angry look, and you can change that between other various looks. Not so angry, disappointed, or happy, and iClone will animate in between those states. Once I'm okay with the facial animation on this second pass, I will save it out as an FBX and usually just overwrite the original animation and then re-import it in Unreal. Now this is a different procedure from overwriting the mesh. In this case, we are reimporting the animation file. To do this, you would select the animation clip itself and right click. And I usually reimport with new file and just select the overwritten file. And of course, it's a lot quicker since you are only reimporting the animations. And once that's all done, I view it and see that our friend now has got a bit of a angry expression. That messy business going on his forehead and his knee is a decal problem, which can be fixed by turning off whether or not the character can receive decals. And those decals are now just affecting the landscape. They're just the bones strewn around in the background that help break up the ground. They're a cheap way to decorate a scene. You can also interpolate keyframes by selecting and right-clicking on your frames and selecting how you want them to be affected. I don't tend to use this method that much because I prefer using the curve editor. And using Bezier curves, you can have a good degree of control over how you want your camera to behave in terms of its movement, how fast it moves, whether it eases in or eases out. So it gives you that level of control should you need it. You can also select the interpolation type via the menu at the top. So for example, if you want a movement that is, or rather doesn't slow down or accelerate, you can select the linear option. So, but that's up to the kind of movement you want. But I'll be covering cameras in more detail later in a future tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed that and found it helpful as an overview. I apologize that I can't go into anything in super detail, but that would end up making this tutorial a couple of hours long. But in the next tutorial, we will be covering animation and retargeting animations, which will allow you to make use of the various different animation sources that can be used on the Unreal platform. Many of them, fortunately, are free, which is always a good thing. So until that next video, you've been watching Mr. H Makes, and this is Mr. H signing off.